we've got the online people who are joining us online on the video feed before I start properly. Are we 24 seconds to go, it looks like? Are we live? Okay, super. So that was a very slick start, obviously. Thanks for joining us, both in the room and online. I'm David Short. I'm the chair of the IET Media Technical Network. We've organised this session to talk about sustainability in media. You know, I think it's hopefully widely acknowledged and understood and appreciated that this is, you know, one of the issues of our age. And I know that there are other issues in the world at the moment, and there shouldn't be a competition between them in terms of what's more important, because we have to solve them all. And our job as media technologists is to try and solve this one. We've got a fascinating set of speakers to hear today. I've had a look through the slides, and I'm really interested to hear what the speakers have got to say over those slides. I have to do the obligatory housekeeping, I'm afraid, and then I'll hand you over to our moderator for the first session. So there are no fire drills planned. So if the fire alarm goes off, certainly for those of you in the room, you need to leave by the fire doors there and there. Go down the stairs, not use the lifts, and then please assemble under Waterloo Bridge for a roll call before leaving or moving on. What were the other housekeeping points? The only other housekeeping point is this event is live on the internet, and will both people to watch live and people to watch recorded. So if you speak or your image is in camera shot, it will be forever imprinted on the internet. So with that, I'll hand you over to our first moderator, Russell Trafford-Jones. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, David. I certainly echo your thoughts there in terms of the importance of this topic. I think sustainability, there's so much to do in general in terms of sustainability. But within broadcast, I think it's fair to say that there's, whether we're talking about the production or the streaming or anywhere in the chain, there's a lot to be done. And there's a lot of activity, a lot of interest right now in understanding what can be done and how we can actually achieve something which is useful and measurable and is beneficial in the future. Fundamentally, we can't fix things, we can't measure them, we can't know if we're succeeding, we can't know whether we've succeeded. So there's a lot of work really finding out how companies and organisations and individuals of all different shapes and sizes can actually get to the bottom of what's happening and how they can improve. So obviously with a lot of work there, and we've identified in the last couple of years a number of big proponents within the industry, and one of which is the BBC. There's a lot of work going on there to understand the challenge, and we have with us today Danielle Mulder, who's going to talk to us about that. She's recently been appointed the Group Sustainability Director of the BBC, and that means working in sustainability. Now, over the years, she has the experience working with global clients and projects, include London 2012 and the Gold Coast Commonwealth. Danielle is a net zero specialist, and we'll come to understand what that means in a few moments, because she's leading the net zero and climate risk programme across the BBC Group. Previously, Danielle was strategist and management consultant with KPMG and Accenture globally. I'm very pleased to invite her to the stand now to tell us more about her work.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here today. So I wanted to sort of give you an overview really in terms of what the BBC is up to with regards to sustainability and putting in place particularly a net zero strategy and what that looks like. So I've been officially in this role since August last year, but I have been working with the BBC since March last year, where I was invited in and we won the contract to deliver the net zero strategy and set science-based targets, and also look at something called TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, so the climate risks on the BBC, and essentially get them set up for COP26. Because we're a major broadcaster at COP26, it was a requirement that we had a net zero strategy, and it was about putting a credible net zero strategy in place. So the BBC recognised that it needed science-based targets, so it needed some scientific rigour to a net zero strategy. It couldn't just put out grand statements about this. And that's what I was charged to do, to sort of come in and actually underpin it with the right science and the right standards to do that. So this is just an overview in terms of sort of like what our key objectives are. So when we're talking about sustainability at the BBC, it's very much about the environmental sustainability. So often people could talk about sustainability, about the broader sustainability being environment, social and governance, the sort of three pillars, if you like. In the context of this, we're very much talking about the environment and in particular what net zero is and what that means for the BBC. So on the slide here, you can see that we recognise the key areas that we need to get right in order to deliver against this. Obviously, our operations, our buildings and our operations, our fleet, and making sure that they are smart, resource efficient and decarbonised as well, essentially eliminating fossil fuels. Sustainable production, that's what we do. We create content, we commission content, we transmit content. What does that look like? So sustainable production is fundamental to our success, and we have been leading the way actually at the BBC. Before I arrived 10 years ago, we actually created a calculator called Albert that some of you might have heard of, which is a calculator that people actually use. We've actually mandated it now at the BBC. So 100% of our productions need to be Albert certified and need to utilise this carbon calculator to estimate and assess what the emissions story is for a particular production. And it also gives some help and guidance on how to reduce those emissions as well. And then climate excellence. So I'm going to come and talk to you about science-based targets and how we go through that process. TCFD as well as part of that. So that's climate risks, predominantly on the BBC, both physical and transition risks. And we're currently going through a process of evaluating those and running what we call climate scenario analysis against those, and also financially quantifying some of those risks as well. So what is the financial impact of us not meeting our science-based targets, for example? Engaging our supply chain, I'll come on to talk about why that's fundamental to our success, because it's a huge proportion of our emissions footprint. So we've got plans in place. We're actually working with CDP on that to instigate and bring industry with us, because it's absolutely essential that we bring the indies, the independent production companies, for example, and some of the bigger players, which have already got some of this in place with us at the BBC to address our emissions together. But finally, and this is a key point, is at the heart of all of this is nature. So we don't just think about this just being about net zero. I know the current news story, and certainly with COP26, was about carbon and net zero. But the backdrop to all of this is that we've also got biodiversity collapse, and it's happening at an alarming rate. So we've got the background rate of extinction is 1,000 times higher than it should be. And that's the sort of natural systems that we need to be in place to actually get us out of this. So it's a little bit further behind. You might have heard of COP15, which is happening in Kunming. It was due to happen in April, but I think it's been deferred again, unfortunately. And that's the equivalent of COP26 in the carbon world, but for the biodiversity world. And frustratingly, these two things are not connected enough, I don't believe, and they need to be. And that's what we're looking at doing at the BBC, is bringing the two themes together, because it's essential that we do. So that's essentially the sort of key objectives that we're looking at. This is a visual to sort of summarise, really, our carbon footprint. So we've got 1.3 million tonnes of CO2 for Scope 1, 2 and 3 on an annual basis against our baseline of 2019 and 20. 2% of that is in our direct operations. We do deploy a lot of REGOs already, which is the renewable energy guarantees of origin against our electricity. But we've got a lot more to do, obviously. So 98% of it sits in our Scope 3, so that's our value chain in effect. And as you can see, if you add up supply chain with equipment, capital goods, which is the number 2 category in Scope 3, it's actually 85% of our footprint is in our supply chain, which is why it's absolutely critical that we talk to our key suppliers and start engaging them on this journey with us. And that's why we're working very closely with industry, with BAFTA, and our peers, actively working with them and actively working with the CDP supply chain solution as well to get the data better. Now, you can see audiences, and I know that Glynn's going to talk about the sort of downstream media emissions. They're not actually part, I'll be honest, they're not part of our target boundary here, and that is completely allowed. We had it double-checked, triple-checked, as you can imagine, whether that was the right thing to do or not, because the emissions actually sit, and Glynn will come on to explain, I'm sure, the end-user devices, that's where they sit. But we're not ignoring those. We actually do have our own consumption model at the BBC, because a lot of the DIMPACT work, which I think we've led on for many years, in all honesty, and helped develop that model, is actually quite focused around the digital side of things, whereas we actually sort of like have terrestrial TV and we also have radio as well. So our consumption model actually picks up all of the transmission emissions for the BBC, and we do calculate those. And we do take that responsibility quite seriously, and we do work with the likes of Ofcom, and we have a blue room that investigates the emissions of particular end-user devices, and we relay that information on in working groups as well to try and make the change. So this is our footprint, which you need. You need a baseline, and this is the official wording for our science-based targets. So we had these approved just before COP, actually. It was a very busy year for me last year, but we did get there. As you can imagine, collecting data sets across the BBC has its challenges in a big global organisation. So we had to pull them from different parts. So it's kind of a federation model as well. And I do find a lot of people underestimate this effort, just to be absolutely clear. Every client, I used to be a consultant, every client tells you that they've got the data, don't they? They all tell you they've got the data. Don't worry about it, we've got the data. And every time they don't. So you have to go in and figure out, where the data sets actually are. So we did actually run a data integrity project on the back of this to ensure that we'd actually picked up the data as good as it gets. Scope 3 is largely estimated. I'm not going to lie about the Scope 3. It's a largely estimated process using tools such as Qantas, which is based on spend, rather than actual emissions or activity-based emissions, which is the ideal world, or actually getting real data from your suppliers themselves. So that's where the market's up to, and we've applied best practice and leaned into the GHG accounting protocol teams and science-based target teams, and had external verification processes in place as well. And this is where we ended up. So we've ended up with a 1.5 degree ambition for our Scope 1 and 2, which are direct operations, of 46.2% is the exact number by 2030. And that, we believe that's the right thing to do. Yeah, it's hard to achieve that at an organisation like the BBC, but that is 1.5 degree aligned. And then 28% reduction for our Scope 3. And the reason why we had a less ambition there is because we really do need to get the data right, and it's probably going to take us 2 to 3 years to get the data for our Scope 3 absolutely crystal. We've also recently, I'm quite pleased with this, managed to get this over the line, we've committed formally to setting the new net zero standard. So we have our short-term or near-term targets in place, which I just showed you. They're approved and in play, and we've got plans against those. And we're also committing to long-term targets, what we call true net zero. And that's a process that we're about to embark on, getting some help from the Carbon Trust, but also the science-based target to get us across the line on defining what true net zero is for the BBC, probably by 2050. Yeah. Hopefully earlier, but we need to do the modelling to complete that process. So that's where we are up to in terms of our strategy and our commitments to targets and the right standards in place. Here we've listed out at a high level, we know if we do everything in this box, all 10 initiatives and projects well, then we will meet net zero. So we know we need to get the data right. That's absolutely fundamental. We want to switch to 100% renewable energy. We're switching to EVs. I've just employed a project manager to drive that process out. So we have a plan. We're phasing it. We're going to execute on that plan. We need to optimise our buildings. We need to get really super tactical here now. We've got the what are we doing? We've got the strategy, we've set it, we've got targets, we need to get the data right, but we also need to get super tactical about how we're going to get there. So if you're going to eliminate fossil fuels, what that means on the ground to production teams, for example, is they need to do a power audit. They need to understand the power they're going to be using on a particular production. They need to determine, do they need all the diesel generators that they think they need, which they don't? Does somebody own the fuel line? Are they monitoring the fuel that they use? And can we change it? Can we reduce the fuel usage? So it does, and to do that in a big organisation where you're working with external partners takes time. And there aren't that many people that you meet that fully understand the concepts here or have been trained on net zero and carbon accounting. So it's a big challenge. We know that if we do everything on the left plus everything on the right here, then we'll be in a leadership position. And fundamental to this is collaboration. We cannot do this on our own, which is why we're working very closely with industry and organisations such as the IET and DPP and other partners, EBU, to understand what does this mean and how we're going to get there. And we're already starting to establish some strategic partnerships to help us deliver on this. As I said, we cannot do this on our own. New technologies and products, looking at our investments as well. Finance has a big play here as well. So we are currently looking at how we finance this because there's quite a lot of investment to be made. But if we make the right choices and the right investments, then we will have, the BBC will be around for another 100 years and we'll be celebrating that success. So this is just the high-level plan, essentially, for our direct operations: reduce, optimise, electrify. And we were working very closely with our partners and colleagues in workplace who actually operate our buildings, our landlords as well, to say, how we're going to get there for our direct operations. International bureaus are part of that. Studio Works, our commercial subsidiaries, and we're actually quite good on measuring Scope 1 and 2. I think a lot of organisations are, to be honest with you, because we report it monthly. We have help from Mighty. We have BMS systems. We know the electricity that we purchase. We have invoices that can back all of this up. So Scope 1 and 2, the data's digital. We're getting that way. Some of our international bureaus, less so, I'll be honest. If you're out in Afghanistan, then you are relying on somebody potentially at the wrong time to be providing you with a diesel invoice. But here in the UK, it's pretty airtight in terms of our Scope 1 and 2 emissions and the standards and emissions factors that are applied against that. The Scope 3 piece, as I said, is largely estimated at the moment, because we essentially take large spend data that comes out of our SAP system and then apply the best available emissions factors against those. And we're also picking up things like franchises and investments and business travel as well. But some elements are actually quite tight, so we know how many flights we take, for example, and how many bookings we have on trains. So these are the plans that are in place, and the big one really is about engagement, which is why, actually, this week we've just hired somebody who sits in the auditorium here with us today to actually help us with engagement. What does that look like and how do we bring people with us, particularly our suppliers. Some of our suppliers actually are knocking on my door already saying, we've seen your strategy, we like it, we like the BBC, we want to help you, how can we help you get there? What do you need from us? So some of them have already sort of jumped the gun on this and already have, like Microsoft, for example, we work quite closely with them at the moment. They have quite an ambitious sort of carbon negative strategy, and they also have internal carbon pricing across their organisation. I'd love to do that at the BBC because, unfortunately, I think unless you actually put a price on this, I think it's going to be really hard to turn that dial the full 90% that we need to achieve absolute zero. This is our data model. I have a bit of a tech genius in the team, Jigna Chandaria, who some of you might have heard her speak before. She's excellent. She's owning this problem, actually, with data. And in terms of putting in place the right platform. So we've been looking at platforms in the marketplace. We can't be doing this manually anymore. We can't be relying on spreadsheets. We have to automate it. We need a proper carbon accounting system in place to help us do this. And that's fundamental to our success. So, watch this space. We'll be making some announcements around what that data platform looks like and how we're going to implement that, and giving divisions and teams their own dashboards so that they can play their part, understanding what decarbonisation actually means for the likes of news, radio, sport. It's all slightly different, to be honest with you, so it does need to be quite nuanced in terms of what's material to them, what they can affect and what their challenges are. But they need data. They need data to understand how they're doing. Are they above the line, below the line? Where are they? You know, which levers do they now need to pull? Where do they need help? CDP I mentioned. So we're about to actually go through the CDP process ourselves as an organisation. So we are asking our top suppliers and encouraging them to declare and disclose their emissions to CDP, because ideally what we want to do is we want to switch the data out from sector averages and the use of industry emissions factors up to primary data. And then the gold standard or platinum standard is to actually use LCA, where we actually understand the emissions of a particular product or service that we purchase. Yeah, it's getting into the sort of DIMPACT level of granularity. But we've got a long way to go. Most organisations are getting their own houses in order, just like we are at the BBC, and putting in place the right foundations to actually capture and report these emissions and then pass them back to their clients and customers, such as the BBC. But this process we've started, so we've handed CDP our top suppliers, and we're about to sort of send out a request for them to join and actually submit their questionnaires themselves. And we're going to be doing the same as well, so it's not like we're asking our suppliers to be doing something that we're not doing. We're actually going through this process ourselves. And we think this is the right way to go. At COP, on the content side, so this is all operational I've been talking about to date. But obviously, as an organisation, we're all about content. Our voice and influence is fundamental to this shifting the industry towards doing everything it can to face into this sort of climate emergency. And so on the stage at COP26, Tim Davies sat with the other broadcasters. There were 12. I think there's now 14 that have signed up. So what we've all committed to is something called a climate content pledge. And that means that we work together, we support each other. It's already happening, by the way. I've actually been in meetings that directly linked as a consequence to this pledge, and integrating that into all of our content. It excludes news at the moment because they have a sort of like editorial independence, but it's not just looking at the green planets, which we are doing impact analysis against, by the way. It's not just the natural history unit and those documentaries. It's also all of our content. It's our soaps, our TV, our radio, etc., and ensuring that we feed it into our incidental content, and also communicating the science as well in an easy-to-reach way, essentially. So we have plans in place with each of the divisions to say, how do we capture that activity? How do we incorporate it right from the outset, from the commissioning, all the way through to our indies and how they produce content, and then how that content also gets delivered as well. Quite exciting, that one. So finally, I just wanted to sort of say that, hopefully I made the point earlier, that you cannot do this on your own, and we're not trying to. You need to collaborate to innovate, and certainly that's the way that we see our success at the BBC. Is yes, we can do as much as we can by being ambitious, I guess, with the strategy and supporting the industry in terms of what they're facing into and this change that's required through training and engagement and webinars and whatever else we can do. But really is to be very open to the problem and to share our journey and be transparent along the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. I think it's very clear how much work is going into the sustainability and at so many different levels and different ways. So we'll talk about that shortly. There's an opportunity to ask questions, whether you're online or in the room, and we hope to have a good amount of time at the end. So please send questions along, and we'll dig into all of the topics raised there. One of which was the DIMPACT, which is a platform and community which allows companies to understand and measure the way in which they're currently impacting the world, and so they can improve in the future. To talk to us more about that, explain it, is Glynn Roberts, who's a senior partner at Carnstone, which is an independent management consultancy and specialises in sustainability. Glynn has a strong environmental experience helping strengthen companies' approaches to water stewardship, energy management and climate change. He advises a range of clients from global manufacturers to UK leading media companies. So Glynn, welcome.
Hello, thank you everyone. It's good to speak to you today. And Danielle, thanks for the overview from the BBC. And there's a number of points that I wholeheartedly support when we're talking about climate change in particular, but sustainability more broadly. The idea of collaboration is so important. I think that, you know, the way that climate change is now placed within a much broader ecosystem. Danielle talked about scope 3, and clearly there's loads of kind of technical jargon associated with this whole area. But we're one part in a much bigger puzzle. So the more people that can come together to kind of share their experiences and share information, the better. And data. Data is absolutely key, and particularly transparency in terms of data. So where there is data, where the quality is good, where we can rely, but also facing up and being quite honest about where we don't have the information we need to make sensible decisions. So I'm pleased to be here today to tell you a little bit about DIMPACT. DIMPACT Digital Impact. And this is about the measurement of greenhouse gases associated with with digital content. The whole idea for this came about from a group of companies that came together. Well, we were having a conversation back in 2015, but as part of something called the Responsible Media Forum, which is a group of media companies that have come together to really think about, okay, from a sustainability point of view, what are our key issues? And it was quite early on in those conversations that people thought, okay, we're increasingly moving on to the internet, we're increasingly seeing the rise of streamers, and what can we do about it? And so a few companies came together to develop DIMPACT, and DIMPACT has now been running for about 3 years. And what I want to do today is just kind of tell you a little bit about the why. I'll explain a little bit about DIMPACT and what DIMPACT is. And then we're in a room full of engineers, I thought you'd be quite interested to see kind of some of the data and some of the information that sits behind it, because I think it's very interesting, and it really hope that the information that we're able to provide via DIMPACT can help with some kind of real world decision making in terms of the way that how content is provided to people and the way that consumers are able to consume that digital content. So the problem, you know, as people were we were seeing the rise of media streaming platforms, things like Netflix, things like iPlayer, of course, and there was an increasing expectation on companies, and there is an increasing expectation on companies to be able to report on their greenhouse gas emissions. So people were asking the questions of media companies, what are you doing? And at the same time, we could see increased growth, more and more growth in terms of the way that content is provided, the way that digital content is provided, and the way and the manner that is provided to consumers. And that was increasingly getting more and more complicated in terms of the way that information was coming from the broadcaster through to the end consumer, and the way that content was then being consumed by the rise of smart devices, TVs. We're now talking about the metaverse. And because of that, there was increased scrutiny from the media in terms of what media companies are really doing about it, how are they thinking about the climate impact associated with digital content. So we were increasingly seeing, and we continue to see, articles, programs, documentaries, which are really trying to kind of give consumers an indication of what's the climate impact of the content that they're consuming. Over the past 24 months, where we've all been consuming our fair share of digital content, and as we go through endless box sets, you know, it becomes really personal. It becomes quite important to consumers to actually understand that. The problem is that a lot of these kind of articles and documentaries are produced in, well, let's not say not quite a vacuum of good data and information, but certainly quite a shortage of good quality information. And it was leading to one or two kind of misleading claims in the media, and certainly some uncertainty about what was the actual impact of this. And so we felt, and the media companies that came together as part of DIMPACT, is that we needed to find a credible way of consistently beginning to measure the impact relating to this content. And so really that's where DIMPACT was born. So what is DIMPACT? So DIMPACT is a collaborative initiative. It's about different companies coming together to share their experiences, to share their information, to measure, understand, and ultimately reduce the emissions associated with serving digital media and entertainment products. Really at the heart of DIMPACT is two things. So one, it was very important that we created a consistent methodology, a platform, a way that companies, media companies, based on one or two parameters that I'll talk about in a minute, were able to measure their digital impact in a common way. But it's also something of a community, because of course, you know, just understanding the numbers is one thing. What you then do about it becomes quite different. And actually, different companies have different emphasis and have different pieces of information and knowledge. You know, the BBC, I think we can all acknowledge, have been at the forefront of these kind of discussions and this kind of research for a long while. But so have others. So we were able to bring all this together. So with leading media companies, with Carnstone, my organisation, convening DIMPACT, and then also working with leading academics, in this case the University of Bristol and the Computer Sciences Department there, we're able to create a platform or a model that would allow these digital emissions relating to digital content to be calculated. And in terms of our participants, so we have 18 companies on board with us, mainly broadcasters, but also some digital publishers and advertisers there. This DIMPACT is creating a lot of interest, so we're having quite a lot of discussion, so we'll be adding 5 or 6 probably companies to that in the near future. And these are big players, so people like the BBC, people like Netflix, people like Sky, people like BT. So these are people, significant organisations that have a significant digital presence. So it's absolutely, we hope, the right place to be having this conversation. And in terms of what DIMPACT does, so there are a number of inputs that I will talk about in a minute, but we've really focused, you know, clearly this is a huge issue and the range of kind of digital content provision ranges. But we've focused our kind of initial efforts at the moment in terms of video streaming. And there was some work that we did in collaboration with the Carbon Trust to kind of look at the impact, and I'll share some of the results of that. We're also looking at online banner advertising. You know, of course, when we're constantly on our browsers, we're seeing banners popping up. You know, what's the impact associated with that? Digital publishing is an important area for at the moment. So, what's the carbon impact relating from moving to from sort of physical consumption through to digital consumption? And then audio streaming. So audio streaming is a new area we're looking at. And of course, we're all listening to BBC Sounds or Spotify. So that's an area of interest as well. And then there's 2 other areas that we're looking at, and we're making good progress with the university and our participants. So one is on video conferencing, which is absolutely fascinating when you start digging into some of the data. We're all shackled to our Teams or Zoom or whatever platform it's using. So it's particularly pertinent at the moment, but also gaming. So we're seeing more and more, not just the kind of traditional media companies providing gaming, so sort of Sony and Nintendo, but we're also increasingly seeing people like Netflix and Microsoft broadening into gaming. So we'll be looking at that as well. So I thought, you know, it would be worth just kind of sharing some of the background in terms of to use the terminology, what does the functional model look like? And essentially what DIMPACT tries to do is quantify the greenhouse gas emissions with everything after the content has been produced. So Albert, as Danielle mentioned, is a very good way for media companies to be looking at the emissions associated with production. So this really takes everything post-production. So it looks at what happens in the data centers and the cloud providers, goes through the content delivery networks that I'm sure our speakers later on will be able to tell us a bit more about, into the internet, and then how that is then distributed via fixed line access and also cellular networks, through the infrastructure within people's homes, through to the end device. and consumption. So that's really the model. Of course, I'm sure you can all appreciate that there's another few levels of complexity that sit beneath that model. Danielle was talking about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, and this just really kind of summarises that model and kind of where it fits. So scope 2 would be the data centres and also into the cloud data centres and CDNs. And then scope 3, and this is kind of sort of a bone of contention at the moment, if broadcasters or media companies are sending out media content, then should they have some responsibility for those indirect emissions? SBT says no, but clearly as a responsible organisation, media companies need to be thinking about that. And what we ask for is so participants are able to go in through a website, which Google, and have a look at the Google website. You will go into that website and they'll give you access to a model if you're part of the initiative. And really it relies on a number of kind of user analytics. So companies are able to provide us with information in terms of the location of users, in terms of the type of devices that are used, things like the average session time, so how long are people viewing the content, how is that content viewed, is it via a fixed line, through a broadband or a fibre line, or is it done through a mobile network, and then also typical file sizes, which becomes important for things like publishing, but things like bit rates in terms of video. Within the model, we then have that kind of user analytics, and you can imagine, some of these organisations, even actually getting that information is quite a task. The model then includes a number of kind of proxies and calculated primary data in terms of the different kind of energy use and the climate emissions associated with each of the functional steps that I spoke about. What's brilliant about DIMPACT is that it's continually evolving. So the more people we get involved, the bigger the scale of the organisations that are getting involved, the increased attention internally within those organisations. We're continually able to refine the data that we're using together with the University of Bristol and the academic rigour that provides, to actually put in place some kind of real world data so we can actually see what's happening. There are some kind of gaps in the data. There are some things that nobody's quite sure about when it comes to things like cloud services, when it comes to managing the complexity around CDNs, which is complicated. I really didn't bother trying to kind of explain some of those bits because I would do a very poor job. But I think what's really important and what's really useful about DIMPACT, so I mentioned the community aspect, is it gives us a consistent way for media companies to be speaking to suppliers, to be able to speak with their partners, to be asking for the same information. And actually the number of times you ask the same question in the same way, actually we're able to unlock quite a lot of information that even 12 months ago there's no way that we could do. And it's important to start that conversation. So everyone's in the same boat. This is all pre-competitive. There really isn't kind of any angles to it. Everyone has an interest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think virtually all the participants within DIMPACT have some sort of certainly ambitious climate target, if not a net zero target, as do some of the people that we're talking to in terms of the suppliers, in terms of that functional chain. So that's DIMPACT, and of course I'm happy to tell you more about the kind of initiative. But I thought what you might be interested in is to look at some of the data and information. So this is some information that was produced on the back of DIMPACT, a piece of work with the Carbon Trust to really offer the definitive single point of truth when it came to the emissions associated with video streaming. And this report's publicly available, quite long and quite weighty, but by all means do check it out. And what this report told us is that on average per hour of viewing via streaming, 56 grams of CO2 are produced. Two things to really note about that. One is actually that number's quite a bit lower than you might think. And secondly is that when you look at where the emissions are, where within the let's call it value chain are, the two hotspots is all about the viewing device. So the kind of, are you watching it on a TV or are you watching it on an iPad? So it's about the viewing device. And then it's also about the home network. So the kind of always-on nature of routers and mesh networks that we have in our homes these days. So really, the 56 grams per hour, it's about the same as boiling a kettle. It's about the same as driving 250 metres in your car. So, what's the big deal about this stuff? And actually, this is where we can look towards the BBC and some of the R&D that's been done in this area. And the reason that it is important is, of course, that it all adds up. So, when you look at the number of viewing hours, particularly in the UK, but if you extend that globally, that becomes very significant. I love this statistic. So the BBC utilised 1.9 thousand gigawatt hours, which is about 0.7% of the electricity consumption in the UK. So it begins to get quite significant, particularly when you put that across all the viewing platforms. The other interesting thing is actually the type of device and how that then affects the way the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, which then begins to offer some questions about, can we encourage consumers to be consuming their content in a different way? For example, is it better over traditional terrestrial TV compared to streaming? Because there are differences, and actually this kind of DIMPACT begins to unlock some of that. If we look at Netflix, so Netflix are part of the DIMPACT family, let's say. So the numbers that they're coming out with are slightly higher, so that's 100 grams of CO2. There are some differences in terms of the scope that they have used, but actually it's the same order of magnitude. But actually here we're talking about a much more global footprint, and the third thing that really comes into play when you're looking at emissions from digital content is the intensity of the energy that you're using in terms of carbon. So in some parts of the world, there is just much more carbon associated with each kilowatt hour compared to, say, the UK. And actually, if you think about the Nordics, where it's virtually zero. And then finally, in terms of the results, I thought this was quite interesting as well. So this is some information from Schibsted, who provide online newspapers and newspapers. So much more of a traditional kind of publishing house. And you can see here that actually the emissions, there's 503 tonnes associated with all the digital content that's produced by Schibsted, and actually most of that is related to the end user device, so what they're reading on, whether it's an iPad or a Kindle or whatever it might be. But actually all that pales into not quite insignificance, but certainly when you begin to compare it to the emissions associated with the physical product, same content delivered in a different way, and each has its place. Actually the emissions associated with digital content are much smaller by orders of magnitude. And again, we're not suggesting that any of these things are right or wrong, but it offers a different way of looking at the decision making within organisations becomes an important part of that process. So that was a very quick kind of canter through DIMPACT. I wanted to share some results. I think they're fascinating and they continue to refine over time, but as we increasingly move into a more digital world, I think these type of questions become more and more important. In terms of the way that DIMPACT is structured, it's a partnership, as I mentioned, between Carnstone and the University of Bristol Computer Science. It's really important that DIMPACT is founded on good quality academic research and thinking, which is why we're just about in the process to establish an academic advisory panel where we're bringing academics and industry experts from around the world to come together to offer us an insight in terms of, and commentary in terms of the methodology which we'll be putting into the public domain in due course. So having that academic rigour, really what we're trying to do is increase the transparency, open up the conversation, try and promote consistency when people are having these conversations, debunk some of the fallacies that are out there. We have a steering group, but also we have specific working groups. So as the fundamental, the tool develops, we'll be looking to enhance that in certain areas where we think that we need more transparency. So we're looking at the cloud service providers, and if you've been looking at what they've been doing, people like AWS and Google and Microsoft have now been coming out with specific carbon calculators associated with their greenhouse gas emissions. But importantly, also about device manufacturers. So we have a group looking at devices and to kind of really get a good understanding about how the different device choices that a consumer makes, and then how can you pair content to particular devices. Well, thank you for your attention. More than happy to take any questions. I'm conscious I just scratched the surface, I think they would say.
Thanks, Glynn. Very much appreciated. Very interesting. There'll be a number of questions, no doubt, in everyone's mind. Now's the time to ask them. We have the opportunity in person and also via YouTube. Before we go to the questions that we do have, I just wanted to ask a question for either of you. Are you able to just specify what Scope 1, 2 and 3 are as a foundation for our future questions?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I realised that I talked in scope speak. So Scope 1 and 2, they're bundled as your what we call direct operational emissions. Scope 1 is the fuel that you purchase and that you burn. So that includes oil and gas, diesel. It's the sort of direct connection with fossil fuels, if you like, and that's why it's called Scope 1. Scope 2 is when, in essence, somebody could be burning fossil fuels on your behalf to generate electricity, and that's your Scope 2. And then Scope 3 is hopefully everything else. It's broken into sort of 15 categories, and that ranges from upstream. We talk about value chain emissions. That's Scope 3, and that's upstream. Categories 1 to 8, I believe it is, and then 9 to 15 is downstream. So the DIMPACT part of it that we were just talking about is in the downstream part, and the use of sold products primarily. The emissions related to the media. The upstream part of it is your supply chain emissions, which is a big problem for the BBC. And there's a tendency at the moment, I've modelled quite a few companies now actually, that about 98% of emissions sit in your Scope 3, about 2%. There is some variance on this, but the line shares in your Scope 3, and then direct operations is sort of like between 1 to 3% typically.
Okay, thank you. David, do we have any questions?
I've got some questions from our online viewers. One from Rohan Madison, and it's directed at the BBC, but I guess it applies equally to all organisations. What's the BBC doing actively to promote working from home as a way of helping net zero strategy? That's the question.
So we've got hybrid working arrangements in place. We're sort of like tackling it from that way because of COVID and what happened essentially during COVID. And we are giving quite a degree of flexibility to the divisions to determine what their working from home arrangements are like. But I think we could go further, in honesty, and I think a lot of companies could in terms of taking responsibility for some of the rising costs that we've got going on and the cost of living at the moment. We are trying to pull people back into the office, because we think that's a good way of working and that we need to see each other. We have what we call essential business needs staff. They need to come in because they're part of our active broadcasting, as you can imagine. So they don't have a choice and they have to come into the buildings that we operate. But there are lots of staff that don't need to do that. So it's trying to find that balance, and it is up to the discretion of the divisions actually to determine what is the right picture for them. But I think we could do more now. We're getting a handle on what the future could look like. I think all organisations should take a bit of responsibility towards the emissions that are happening at home, and advising staff on what they can do about their emissions perhaps from home. We do have thoughtful green travel plans in place as well. So if you are travelling into the office, then to think about public transport and how you get there. And we have, bike schemes in place, etc., to support that. So, yeah, I think we could do more, to be honest, but we are looking at supporting staff. Now we're coming out of COVID and we can see the future.
Thanks. I've got some other questions from online, but you might want to take some in the room as well.
Question over there.
Hi, it's Annie Krukowska. Glynn, thank you so much for and you of course as well, Danielle, for the information about DIMPACT. And do you have any practical examples of DIMPACT score already driving the change amongst your participants in the forum and in the initiative?
There are some anecdotal sort of let's say kind of nudge behaviours that we can see people already thinking about. But actually, this area is so new that people haven't even got through the question of kind of quantification. So they can't really think about sort of influencing and changing people's behaviours until they get that. But it's really interesting how quickly the conversation moves on, and that's really why I'm so enthusiastic about DIMPACT, is once people have the number, they can then think about, okay, well, perhaps I can serve content in a different way. Perhaps I can influence our consumers to be consuming the content in a different way. There's sort of a famous sort of anecdote that people use about YouTube, is that they, when people were sort of looking at YouTube, it was broadcasting the video as well as the audio. But somebody at YouTube realised that actually some people, or a fairly significant proportion of people, were just consuming the audio part of it through their earphones. So a really simple thing that they could do to reduce the emissions would just to turn off the video part. And we're seeing kind of people thinking about, and ultimately, what kind of information can we provide to the consumer so they can make their own decisions about what they do, as well as actually from the media side, there are some decisions about the way, for example, digital content is cached within data centres. So, Game of Thrones, for example, might be cached in a data centre and then kind of squeezed down to every home. But actually, other content is delivered and it goes all the way through the network, and that has a different kind of carbon value associated with it. So, not yet, but I think we'll soon be seeing some big organisations sort of talking about this digital content and actually telling consumers about, what's the impact, what are the emissions associated with it.
So I've got another online question from Ben Let or Lette, apologies for the pronunciation. Is the BBC buying only green energy now, and if not, why not? So it's actually a two-part question. And the other part of the question is basically about the demarcation point. So, for example, if content's going out through a CDN, do you consider the core network and the access network equipment as part of your scope, or is that part of the scope of the consumption at home?
That's quite a complicated part too. The first part of it is that we buy a lot of REGOs, renewable energy guarantee of origin at the moment, to secure that sort of green energy, and so that we have to report our emissions, what market-based emissions as they call them, and then location-based emissions. So the location is the grid, it's the UK grid, and what that serves up in terms of its energy mix, which is obviously it changes. You can actually track it on a website if you're interested to look at how it changes. I think every half hour that those figures are updated. So we've deployed as much as we can in terms of doing what we're allowed to do under REGOs. Whether that's the right or wrong answer in the future to be debated. I'd like to push the BBC towards a purchase power agreement to really size our electricity usage, and then to determine, what the right answer is if we were going to actually direct source renewable energy, through a purchase power agreement. I know that's leading practice. We're sort of doing it in stages, if you like. Some of our markets globally don't have access to renewable energy, and so we're quite early on in that journey in determining how we help those markets actually get coverage or access to renewable energy sources. But certainly in the UK, I think, we're doing the best that we can. There are some gaps. Northern Ireland, Channel Islands, for example, don't have coverage under REGOs as well. So there's a whole project around and a lot of people are getting, finding out that there's a problem here if you don't have a proper energy strategy in place here, when you're going to actually, because the energy prices are going through the roof for everybody at the moment. So it's bringing this not into focus just because of carbon, but also because of the cost of energy as well, and how we purchase that and eliminate that risk for the BBC. The part 2 of it, we do have a consumption model. I'd have to defer, to Jigna actually in terms of, what media specifically you're talking about and whether it's part of our ecosystem. I believe our consumption model does actually pick up as best it can all of it. That was, can we capture this? So we have got a model in place that is aligned to the DIMPACT model, and that line of delineation of when it leaves the BBC architecture in effect or infrastructure, and then it becomes actually part of Scope 3. So yeah, but I'd need more information to answer the question in terms of, if that makes sense.
So that does make sense. So I mean, it sounds like when it leaves the CDN, it's in your Scope 3.
Yeah.
But DIMPACT, you may have that modelled in a more...
Yeah, I mean, like any complicated problem over time, the sort of approaches, the level of sophistication and the level of maturity kind of increases. And I think that actually, when we're talking about Scope 3 and we're talking about net zero, there is acknowledgement that actually the conversations that may have been, it's your problem, not mine, have kind of disappeared. It's kind of everyone's problem. So what is my Scope 1, my energy use, is your Scope 3 and vice versa. And actually, if we're all committed, if we're all serious about net zero, then we all need to take action. And actually, it's much better if we can understand what each other are doing and take action at the same time.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions on the floor here?
I think a bit of a personal question, because I have deep respect for both organisations, and I think you've done some tremendous work over the last few years in this sector. Kind of from a personal point of view, I wonder if there's any easy wins that you guys have seen in looking at the strategy in front of you at this point. That were you, I don't know, a regulator, or were you somebody who was just the managing director of your entity, that you could just go and target? Are there any easy wins which you're seeing emerging from the work you're doing that you could hit hard, hit fast over the next 12 months and really have a significant impact in the digital media energy space?
Shall I have a little crack?
Shall I go first? You can give me a chance to think. I think what's really important about this conversation is to be led by the data in terms of what the data. And it is incredibly complicated when you get into the real nuts and bolts of the functional model. But even at the top level, you can see that there are one or two areas that are actually really important when it comes to digital content and greenhouse gas emissions. And that's associated with the consumption of media through devices and with kind of home infrastructure, so the router. So, if you were going to look at two places where, we could actually make quite a significant difference rather than kind of tweaking around the edges, it would be those kind of things. And I already know that there is some work, certainly some of the broadband providers are thinking about the way that routers operate. Because actually, your router is on 24/7, using energy, creating emissions, absolutely irrespective of the data that's going through it. So you could be watching nothing, or you could be watching iPlayer 24 hours a day. It wouldn't make any difference. So, are there ways of kind of throttling that energy power consumption up and down? And that begins to get kind of quite tricky. The other thing is, what content is best served for what device? Is it better to watch it on a kind of a 70-inch Ultra HD TV or an iPhone? And actually, is some content suitable for different kind of types of content? Or actually, in the example that I gave about YouTube, actually there are kind of some sort of interesting things. Do you need to provide all the content at the same time, or can you just drip feed it or provide bits? So there's lots of kind of interesting things, but those are the two areas that I would focus on.
Thank you. Just to follow up, I guess, there's sort of quick wins. Not really, actually. Annoyingly, well, we've got a lot of rego cover already across our electricity at the BBC. I think a few other of our peers, and they're doing, making great strides in this area as well. I'm fully committed to it. Are picking up some initial significant reductions by applying regos to their electricity. And you'll see big drops, and that's generally related to somebody purchasing renewable energy certificates. We've got to get rid of our gas. Gas is our main problem at the BBC, and that's quite hard and it's expensive, and particularly when you're in leased properties. So you've got to negotiate with your landlord. Space. Think about space. Do you need all that space? Because if you've got space, you've got energy, and you've got a problem, basically. So, do you really... And lots of clients are thinking about this when they powered down during COVID successfully. Do they need the space that they currently have committed to? So those... Switching to EVs is actually quite significant. We've modelled an 8% reduction potential from switching to an EV fleet. So that's a significant to electrify the fleet essentially and move away from fossil fuels. That takes quite a bit of work. What I talked about earlier about encouraging people to do audits, really. Again, not just against our buildings, but again at the production level as well, sort of a power audit. Let's be realistic about how much power that we actually need to use. I think we've been lazy, I think, and I'm not just talking about the BBC, I'm just talking about generally in terms of production teams saying, I think I need more, I need 2 generators, I need 100 kilowatt hour generators when they don't. And we actually look at those generators and they're only running at 10%. So a battery could have been a very useful alternative to that situation. But it's getting quite tactical, I'll be honest with you, on that operational sort of side of things. And then the Scope 3 piece is working with the likes of DIMPACT to really highlight, okay, let's get into a particular problem and what are the quick wins or the longer term investments that we need to make. The supply chain, the data is potentially 30 to 40% out in terms of accuracy, yeah? So if you look at the Qantas system, which everybody's using, for example, they're based on US grid intensity factors. That's from a few years ago. So actually, if you get really nice and tight on your suppliers' data themselves, you can make huge strides in terms of reduction potential just from getting the data improved.
Thank you. Okay, let's have another question from online.
So there are a couple of questions online which sort of, as far as I can see, are two sides of the same coin. So one's from Tom Oliver and the other one's from Fiona Fairmanner. So Fiona asks, if terrestrial is the most efficient, why not go back to terrestrial? And Tom Oliver asks what impact the metaverse will have on models and energy consumption.
I'll leave that one for you. You got a chance for that?
Yeah. So on the terrestrial question, but actually it's far more complicated. I'm sure we can all appreciate in terms of the consumer's demand for content and the way that they want that, the convenience of kind of different devices, consuming data on the go, the kind of the quality of kind of content, the SD versus HD versus UHD versus 16K or whatever they're talking about now. So the world moves on, but actually I think there's probably always a place for terrestrial TV. But actually, it's, to be quite frank, some of the younger consumer, they're kind of not interested in consuming the content in the same way that perhaps we might have done. The metaverse, well, who knows? It's content in a way. I think that we're already seeing evidence of a permanently connected lifestyle. If you look at the difference between a fixed access broadband compared to a mobile one, there are significant differences already. So that's a kind of a nuance when we're talking about the metaverse. But yeah, we'll add that to the list to look at next year.
I think that we should just bear in mind that all of this conversation goes in, with saying already that the big element of the media industry is entertainment, and we have to acknowledge that people are going to be entertained, and if they're going to choose to do that in certain ways, then we have to follow that and be as sustainable as possible. So it's all very well saying, well, the most efficient way is Freeview, that's okay, but we can't then shut down everything else because it's not that kind of environment. Is there another question?
So I had a question about the difference between carbon neutral and net zero.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's sort of that one,
but I think it's quite interesting.
Well, I think, isn't language fascinating? And certainly even the definition of net zero has changed over the last few months with the introduction of the Science-Based Target Initiative net zero standard. In basic terms, carbon neutrality would be sort of part mitigation, so reduction of emissions, and what you couldn't then reduce or mitigate, you would then use offsets, carbon offsets, so through tree planting or other projects. So your kind of net your net position was neutral. With net zero, that's very much focused on an actual reduction in emissions. And so the net zero standard from the SBTi says that you are only allowed to be classed as net zero. Well, it's not actually quite net zero. You need to reduce 90% of your emissions. So that's the difference.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think we need to wrap this session up now. Unfortunately, many more interesting questions yet to follow, but thank you both, Glynn and Danielle, for joining us. For those of us who are in the room, then we'll be going to the adjacent one. If you're online, then we'll be back at the top of the hour.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Nuck. I'm here to moderate the second session. So here we have an eclectic mix of presenters who are going to go through and provide their perspectives on their individual levels, much more in the distribution side, and then followed up by a more general discussion from some parties. So probably the best thing to do is just introduce each person in turn. We have Don Robinson, who's here from the Greening of Streaming. We have Tim Miller from Plum Consulting. And we have Martin Koehring from Economist Impact. So really, I'm not here to really say that much more than that. I really want to introduce Don first, who's going to step up and give you a very different presentation, I believe.
So the expectation setting in. Yes. Actually, so thank you to Ian and to David and to the IET, Phoebe, everyone for bringing together today. The BBC and the DIMPACT presentations were excellent. I'm going to give you a little potted sort of 10-minute intro to greening of streaming. It's possibly, hopefully, highly complementary to some of the topics that have been mentioned so far today. So it starts with a little bit of a personal background. I've been working with streaming and more specifically content delivery networking since 2000 when I built one of the first CDNs here in the UK. Very focused on live delivery, and that still remains a passion. So today I still run a software company specialised in selling software into the streaming and live content delivery space. Somewhere in that 20-25-year journey, I started writing for a magazine called Streaming Media. And as part of that, in the last few years, I've been chairing and programming the Content Delivery Summit for them, having done similar over here in London for many years. So a lot of history in the CDN space and the content delivery networking space, which is the engineering which gets the streams from the broadcasters to the consumers. As one does when one's wife is away, a couple of springs ago, I watched a film about data centres. And I was quite blown away at quite how much of the Appalachian Mountains were being removed to fuel coal-powered data centres in the eastern seaboard in the States. And I started thinking about some of the infrastructures that I've been involved with and I've been helped to architect and build out. And I started thinking about how much energy was used specifically by streaming in that context. So I first of all wrote an article for Streaming Media magazine called Greening of Streaming and thought the name was quite catchy, so I just spontaneously registered the domain and set up an email catch-all to talk, as I socialised the topic amongst the industry, to catch emails from people who are interested in this issue. So this is late 2017, early 2018, that cycle happened. Over the course of the following CDN conferences, as my chairman's prerogative, I started asking the architects of the big CDNs and the big delivery networks that largely deliver 70-80% of the world's content today, what their sustainability strategies were, what they were doing in terms of engineering around optimizing efficiency in those networks. And they all stared at me blankly and said, I don't know, we normally ask the FD what energy he buys. And that was pretty much the extent of it, if I'm brutally honest. We aren't talking small companies here, we are talking global broadcasters and international operators and so on. It simply wasn't part of the conversation. So as the greening of streaming itself grew to a little bit more critical mass, we propositioned forming something like a trade association. So back in the early 2000s, when my CDN had been one of the first ones here in the UK, we'd joined the Internet Service Providers Association. I'd become quite interested in internet diplomacy and how trade associations can interface with regulators and policymakers to self-regulate and to present a coherent position for an industry to policymakers and to people interested in various topics. So we propositioned bringing the greening of streaming together, and having also already had a day job, already having a day job, I talked to my colleagues and we set greening of streaming up as a not-for-profit external to my software company. I appointed Adam Cohen, who's sitting in the audience here today, as our exec director, so he can take the brunt of the day-to-day secretariat function and so on, and building members. We invited from DIMPACT, or more specifically from Bristol University and the school around that, we invited Dan Sheen to talk to the industry to start to educate us in the language of climate science in the context of digital media. As engineers, we can talk about caching and network efficiencies and give you all sorts of information in that sort of context till you frankly drop dead in boredom. But the climate scientists have a different language and a different way of understanding this data, and it wasn't familiar to our industry. So we had an initial event, and we brought in some of the big actors who were showing interest, Akamai and Intel in particular. Akamai are probably less well known than Intel. They, however, do deliver probably half of all the video streaming you might see, so they are behemoth in our sector. We asked them to present at our inaugural meeting last September, and around that we launched the Greening of Streaming as a members association, and pretty much instantly picked up about 10 members and got together in a sort of organic, chaotic, haphazard way in October and started working out what the members wanted to do and how we wanted to sort of self-govern. I think the interesting thing is the very first cardinal rule of Greening of Streaming is no greenwashing. So for those of you that don't know what greenwashing is, essentially it's using sort of hyperbole in your climate science to market yourself. And we felt that it was important as a group of vendors to self-regulate and to keep a check and balance on each other. So in a sort of club-like mentality, it's a blackballing offence if you greenwash, and that's substantiated by members, which is a way to keep some integrity in the membership badging and your association with Greening of Streaming without too much oversight and accountancy from our own point of view. Being evolved from engineers, we are actually about making a change. We are actually about understanding how you can better distribute live streaming, distribute on-demand streaming, how you can better compress video, how you can do all the technical things and really make a difference. It's not a push things down to scope 3. In some ways, it's often said amongst our group, we are everyone else's scope 3. And we're putting our hands up and grabbing hold of that and trying to actually practically make a difference. So we also have a function where we're setting ourselves up to engage with public policy makers. Taking a leaf out of ISPA's book, we are, for example, holding a public event in Parliament, sponsored by the Shadow Energy Secretary over here in the UK, who's been very supportive, to present ourselves as a coherent voice for the streaming industry and the digital media streaming space to policymakers, certainly here, initially here in the UK, but we have aspirations to do the same in Europe and in US Congress over time. So two different sides to the group. The activities themselves are working group organised. Working group 1 is lovely and esoteric, and it's about learning the language and about developing lexicon and about developing measures and terms that we as an industry agree on that we can make changes to. There's a lot of external influences pointing fingers and saying we've estimated you're doing this, but we actually know. We do run the computers, we have the physical infrastructure. We're going to put measures in there and try and actually bring that together in a way that's consistent across the members and in a way that when we talk to each other, at least, we understand exactly what we're talking about. So although it's a bit esoteric, that lexicon working group, it's quite an important foundation, and we've taken lots of advice again from organisations like Bristol University on how we might develop that language. Working group 2 is functional outreach, growing the membership base and so on. And working group 3 is probably the long-term aim of what we're doing, which is to share best practice and develop that best practice. But at the moment, we don't even have a needle. We haven't done the science-based measurements. We haven't got there yet. We haven't reached a consensus between ourselves. So working group 4 is very much about that as a practical experiment. It's kind of exploded since December, and we're now already in the process of developing prototype measurement tools across CDNs. We've got some amazing input from Intel and AMD. AMD joined recently, so we're getting very deep insight and instrumentation measurement into the infrastructure itself. And also on top of that, we have Akamai, who are opening up their entire infrastructure to us, and we're talking more and more to other clouds and other telcos about becoming members and helping us aggregate this data We don't want to mark our own homework. We are going to use members' fees to commission organisations outside of greening of streaming to help us understand where the needle is. We want to get several of those. To some extent, the data may well just be made open so that we can have any party give us an interpretation. But certainly in the first instance, we want to commission some analysis of these data aggregations so that we can put our finger on our own pulse and have a sense of where the needle is, and then hopefully over the subsequent year, try to get a handle on where that data is and make a change, make a real practical change in the infrastructure. Just to give a final comment, this diagram I did initially as a thought piece, and if I can zoom in on it, which I can't seem to do now, it's really too small, I think, unfortunately. Hold on, let me try one more time. Right, I can't get in there. Anyway, this is a thought piece I did, which is an end-to-end layer 0 to layer 4 picture of a live streaming infrastructure. Now, the set-top box environment and the routing environment that we heard about in presentations earlier is essentially where that orange box is and where the first circle is. There's a lot of distribution amps, there's a lot of splitters, there's a lot of routers and switching and infrastructure. In fact, the top boxes should all be clouds, just to give some idea of how much infrastructure needs to be provisioned to get a live stream from production to a consumer. A lot of organisations think that middle bit is magic. Okay, it's really not. I've put the stuff together physically. It's really not magic, and it uses a lot of power before you even get one stream through. So our expectation from our working group for live event analysis is that actually we won't see any difference between a completely unloaded infrastructure and an infrastructure with 5, 10, 20 million people watching a stream, because these infrastructures are provisioned for peak at the moment. And so it doesn't matter if you've got no streams or 30 million streams going through them, they're still burning an awful lot of power. What we hope is, once we've got that picture, to start turning infrastructure off when it's not used, turning infrastructure off quickly after a live event, and better signalling between organisations. So we're very joined up across organisations. So developing better ways to coordinate these live events, coordinate this infrastructure provisioning to minimise and become a good energy citizen. We don't know about sustainability. I think what our data output will generate will be translatable to sustainability metrics and so on. But what we can measure is watts, and we're trying to reduce the wattage, but maintain the quality of the streaming. So that's what greening of streaming is about. A little bit of a rattle in 10 minutes. There we go. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Dom. Right, so move quickly on then. We're going to go to a slightly different area of delivery of services. We'll move across to Tim Miller of Plum Consulting, who's going to come and tell you about their work in this area. Thanks again.
I'll wait for the slides to come up. Just while we're waiting. So my name's Tim. I'm a partner at Plum Consulting. We are a telecoms and media and online consultancy. Economists on one side, engineers on the other, and we sort of meet in the middle. I have been doing work in this area for like 20 years or so, but very little, admittedly, on the environmental side, because as an economist, I like to talk about costs and not emissions. However, one of the things that we've been finding over the last few months, especially talking about things that we've heard about earlier today, is actually there's a lot of parallel between the way that costs are incurred and the way that emissions are felt. We've always talked about kind of fixed costs and variable costs. We heard earlier about fixed emissions and variable emissions in terms of economies of scale and so on. So actually it's a really interesting parallel for us to think about. I think hopefully this will work. Yes. We were commissioned by the UK Spectrum Policy Forum, which is a group that sits within Tech UK that advises DCMS and other government bodies in the UK on issues to do with spectrum. Obviously, the clue's in the name. And one of the questions that they had was about, is there an issue in the way that spectrum is being awarded in the UK and around the world that is leading to greater than needed carbon emissions? So what we wanted to do was to think about how does spectrum policy
at all affect climate change? Is there anything it does that's good, anything it does that's bad? What should the government be doing to try and make sure that it's sitting within the government's overall net zero targets? What should they be doing about the way that they deal with spectrum? And to start with, this was inspired by something that the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, the RSPG, did, looking at spectrum policy and climate change. And there was a big submission from the GSMA, which is the industry association, the Global Industry Association of Mobile Operators. They put in kind of 10 points about how governments around the world should change their spectrum policy to make sure that emissions were reduced. Now, coincidentally, each one of those 10 points was very good for the mobile industry. Just how it happened. So we want to look at those, but we want to think about things in a bit more holistic way, because spectrum is not just used by mobile. And I'm sure that people in the room here and watching online know for all that there are lots of things that spectrum is used for, some of which mobile wants to use that spectrum as well, and you sort of have to balance that a bit. So what did we want to do? And I kind of put out here now that this study is available online. I'm not going to go through everything in detail. If you're interested, then please do go and download it from the Spectrum Policy Forum website, Tech UK. There is a link on our website as well, but I think it goes straight to their website because they paid for it. We wanted to think, first of all, about how do we get to climate change? You know, what in the telecoms industry as a whole affects climate change. And the reason we did this was because we started off thinking about spectrum policy and climate change and found that nobody had thought about it so far. There was just basically no research. So we started to think about ICT generally. How does telecoms, media, and so on impact on climate change? And we thought about this actually in a number of ways and found that, I'll go into it in a bit more detail soon, but it's both good and bad, because there are good bits where we are able to use telecoms instead of travelling. We are able to use telecoms to collaborate better and make things more efficient. That is a good thing from the environmental point of view, because it means that we're cutting down emissions. But it's also bad because doing this means that we are burning energy to actually get the telecoms working. So telecoms is both an enabler and a polluter, which is great, apart from the fact that nobody's actually measuring any of this. We heard earlier about people not monitoring, not measuring what the issues are. So we really needed to kind of understand how, going forward, people could actually start to look at that. On the other side, I'll come back to that in a moment, but on the other side, there is this question about spectrum policy. How does spectrum policy then feed into that? And having identified how telecoms overall feeds into climate change, we were then able to think about spectrum policy generally and spectrum policy changing the way that people use telecoms. And we'll go through some of that in more detail. As I said, there was a load of literature on the first of these, and that was the easy part of our job. The second part was less easy. And I'd love to be able to say that we came up with a lovely number of minus 10% if we did this, but actually it's impossible to do, partially because things aren't measured in the first place, and secondly because we couldn't identify any specific impacts. So the first of these, I've mentioned this briefly, but let's just talk about the way that the communications sector has an impact on climate change. And I want to be really clear, we're not just talking about telecoms here, we're talking about broadcasting, we're talking about amateur radio, we're talking about the energy sector using spectrum. And if you look at Ofcom's list of who uses spectrum, then every single one of those has an impact on climate change. We do concentrate on telecoms a lot because that obviously is a massive industry and a big user of spectrum. But the real danger is that with them making the most noise, then you start to allocate more spectrum to them, taking away from other people who might actually have a significant impact. And that includes the people like the energy industry. The energy industry rely on some kind of either dedicated spectrum or dedicated networks using other people's spectrum to get up-to-date, accurate, constantly evolving information on energy use so they can make sure that it's being provided in the most efficient way and they can plan going forwards how it's going to be delivered and produced. There's a massive danger, and I went and spoke to the Joint Radio Company, which is a group of UK energy companies, about what they need to use spectrum for. And their concern is that all their spectrum is going to be taken away and given to mobile because mobile shouts a bit louder than they do. But they're really concerned that that's going to inhibit the way that they can actually monitor stuff. It's also very important for science services. Science services, things like radio astronomy is not necessarily something that has a direct impact on climate change in the UK now, but it does change the way that we can kind of research and understand the science of climate going forward as well. So it's very important that we actually understand that the spectrum is used by many different people. Now, on the other side, as I said, it's a polluter. And it's very interesting hearing earlier about how the biggest part of the pollution comes at the end user side, where it's the home routers and the devices. Because actually that's something that we identified, that it's the handsets, it's the mobile networks on the access side that is much more important than the core side. People are talking all the time about reducing the need for microwave backhaul links for mobile networks, because you can use fibre and it's much more efficient. But actually, that is such a minuscule part of the problem. It's about the access networks and making sure that they are as efficient as possible. The mobile networks do have a role to play on the core side. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do stuff if you can. But there's a lot more around the use of green energy and so on that they can do. We also looked at fixed networks. We looked at broadcasting. We looked at the way that, and if I say broadcasting, is television and radio. And we looked at kind of amateur and so on as well, just to see if there was anything important there. But we found this kind of this very interesting point around the fact that it's both positive and negative for climate change. And we really need to get the positives working better and get rid of the negatives. So what we then did was, as I said, we looked at lots of literature and found virtually nothing on the second part, but lots on the first part. So we decided to go and talk to people, and we talked to people all around the industries, and the steering board at the SPF, and just looking at the way that people had responded to public consultations on related areas and so on. And we came up with a list of policy options. These are things that theoretically governments around the world could do to try and make sure that they are reducing climate change, reducing emissions as much as possible, because our focus was very much on emissions rather than, as we talked about earlier, the kind of production of equipment and so on, although we do talk about that as well. We came up with a list of policy options. It's very focused at the UK, but actually we've already gone and spoken to the French regulator about this. We've got interest from the Portuguese regulator about this. It's actually quite applicable across the world. And our policy options are on a lovely table, which is a little bit confusing because we've got stuff that moves across different bases. We categorised them in a few different ways. So first of all, we thought about the way that spectrum is awarded. So who do you give it to? The second point, and that's the purple. The second point is around, if you do give people spectrum, then what must they do with it? And then the third point, which is the orange, which kind of feeds into the pink a bit, is not what must they do with it, but how can you incentivize people to use spectrum in a more efficient way? Because there are some things you just can't regulate for. As I said, I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but I think it's very interesting to talk about some of these, because there is some stuff here that basically people don't really talk about. The first of them is, number one up there, is spectrum for 5G. Now, spectrum for 5G is ongoing in the UK, making sure people have enough spectrum to make sure that their networks are running efficiently. And it's not just about the amount of spectrum, it's about where the spectrum is in the bands. So making sure that you have enough lower frequency spectrum so that you don't have to have too many base stations in place, but making sure that you have enough higher frequency spectrum as well so that you have sufficient capacity to enable people to actually make use of their devices without having to have really high power on their devices to communicate. And the reason that that's important, and it's important kind of across the entire industry, is because so many things are looking at using 5G technologies in addition to kind of the traditional ones. And making sure you've got enough bandwidth there to cover things like kind of meter monitoring and so on is really key. But then, as well as the amount of spectrum, you have to think about the way it's allocated. Historically in the UK, we had a problem in that bits of spectrum were given to different operators, and there were bits all over the place. That's largely been resolved now. It's more difficult in other countries, but it's more costly in terms of energy use to have non-contiguous spectrum. So kind of trying to make sure everything is a bit neater actually helps on that point. And again, that's not just for mobile, but also for different types of broadcasting and so on. And then 3 and 4, I think here, I've mentioned them already, but it's a really key thing that people sort of get, this sort of gets lost in a lot of the arguments, that you need to have spectrum for other services, science services, energy services. Making sure that that's available and that they have the right sort of spectrum means that you can go down the monitoring route and you can make sure that you are being much more efficient than you otherwise would be. So who you give spectrum to is a really important thing. But then how those people use the spectrum is also important. And there has been a lot of work done over the last couple of decades about how to make sure you incentivize people to use their spectrum in an economically efficient way. Yeah? And this is a really key point I'll come back to in a minute. You've got to make sure you use the spectrum in an economically efficient way. We award it using an auction to make sure the people who are going to get the greatest economic benefit from it get to the spectrum. You make sure that you overcome any market failures by putting coverage obligations on so that people must cover 99% of the population. You make sure that people are only allowed to use certain power limits in areas because you're worried about RF radiation and so on. All of this stuff kind of comes from an economic point of view. And this is fine, but there's a trade-off there, because if you are coming at it from an economic point of view, you're not thinking about the environmental impact. This also comes down to the incentivizing options part. People are not penalised for holding spectrum that they've held for years and years and years. The mobile operators have all the spectrum they use for 2G, still running 2G networks. Still running 3G networks. We've got a point here about switching off legacy networks. And everyone, whenever I say this, people think, oh, 2G, 3G, when's that going to be turned off? I want to throw a bit of a bomb in the room and say, yes, that's DTT. That's FM radio. That's anything that could be switched off. And this is a long-term issue. Yeah? This is not something that we want to do next year. But we need to think, is it actually efficient to be running terrestrial TV in the future? I won't talk about other things in detail because I've got limited time, I know. So what are our recommendations? Now, this is a really important point. I was talking about the fact that we look everything in terms of economic and economic costs and making sure that everything is done efficiently under that. And indeed, if you look at Ofcom's duties in terms of awarding spectrum, they have 2 big duties. It's not phased exactly like this, but they have to make sure that spectrum is being awarded in an economically efficient way, and they have to make sure it's being awarded in a socially efficient way to kind of maximise social welfare. They do not have to make sure it's awarded in an environmentally efficient way. And in fact, if they take account of environmental impact when they're awarding spectrum, they are going against their duties and they are acting against their charter. So that has to change. And this is not restricted to Ofcom, because we found a really interesting report from the National Audit Office pointing that out. This applies to Ofwat for the water industry and Ofgem for the energy industry as well. They do not have to, and in fact they are not allowed to take account of environmental impacts when making policy decisions. So first thing, that needs to change. The second thing is that, as we've said a couple of times today, there isn't a monitoring and measurement regime in place, and there needs to be. And that needs to be run by a regulator. It needs to be run by a third party. And when I say a regulator, I'm not necessarily talking about Ofcom, but it needs to be a third party who does it. So those are 2 kind of big things. And then after that, we got a list of the things from the previous slides, which we've ranked in order of which have the biggest impact and which are the shortest and easiest to implement. The first thing is actually, it's a really important thing around protecting the science spectrum, but it's really easy to do because you just maintain the current level, but it must be done. And then we have kind of a list of others here, and I won't go into each of those because I've talked about most of those already. And that's what we came up with as our recommendations for the industry to take to DCMS and to take to Ofcom. And that's where I'd like to finish. So I hope that that's useful, and I look forward to any questions on that later. Ian.
Thank you very much, Tim. We'll come back to the controversial comment later, I'm sure, in the questions regarding DTT. But then I'd like to introduce you now to Martin Koehring from the Economist Impact organisation. So please come along and tell us a little bit more.
Thanks a lot, Ian. Thanks a lot, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you today. So, I was really fascinated to learn from Dom about, the kind of streaming, greener streaming, and also from Tim about spectrum policy and climate change. I hadn't really thought about those things. And, what I'm going to talk about is the kind of the broader context. We have done a study at Economist Impact, so just by way of introduction. So I lead the World Ocean Initiative at Economist Impact, as well as I'm a senior manager for the Sustainability, Climate Change and Natural Resources practice that we have at Economist Impact. We've only recently formed Economist Impact, which is really exciting development in the Economist Group. Obviously, we produce the Economist newspaper. We do a lot of other things. We have our own events. Actually, this week is the Sustainability Week at Economist Impact. And we also have a consulting business. We have a thought leadership business. We produce like indexes from food sustainability to electric vehicles and so on. And this is all now consolidated under Economist Impact. And as part of Economist Impact, we produced this study on sustainable disruption, the 12 decarbonizing technologies for cities. So in a way, this is kind of the broader context of what we are seeing in terms of technology. There hasn't really been a study that combines these elements. There's been a lot of focus on decarbonization, there's been a focus on technology, and there's been a focus on cities. So bringing all this together is quite unique. And we were commissioned by Osborne Clarke, the law firm, to look into that. So just in terms of the background for the study, and then the technology itself, and then the city policy. So that's the kind of the structure. So in terms of background, so obviously this is such an important topic, if we look at decarbonization, and particularly in cities. Because we looked at, you can look at decarbonization in a broader sense, but cities really account for 2/3 of the world's energy. So it's really crucial to look at decarbonization in the context of cities. And also they account for more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. So the focus on cities made sense. And obviously with more than, at the moment, about 70% of the global population expected to live in urban areas. By 2050 is really, I think at the moment it's about 2/3, but it's rising and rising. So the global population will be living in urban areas, more and more. And so hence we focused on cities, we focused on decarbonization, we focused on the latest technologies that work in cities. So we looked at 12, actually we had a long list of 26, and we honed in on 12 because these have impact, as well as are scalable, as well as are investable. But they are not necessarily the best technologies, but they're technologies that have an interesting story to tell, and they could be applied now that, where, we could see an acceleration in decarbonization if we focus on these technologies more and more. They have opportunities to create jobs. They, they can lower costs. They can improve quality of life. And we looked at 10 cities in the world as a kind of a sample for this study. Just in terms of the approach, so we had a literature review that looked at all the different decarbonization trends in cities. Then we did a data audit. We convened an advisory board, as we tend to do in our research projects. And then we did the data collection and analysis. And we did this for these 10 cities. So London is part of that, but we also looked in Europe, Barcelona, for example, Paris, Berlin, and Florence. So kind of a spread there in terms of cities in Europe, but we also looked at New York and San Francisco in the US, and in Asia we looked at Delhi, Seoul, and Singapore. So we looked at the applicability of these technologies in those cities. And the sectors we looked at, so first of all, we looked at building and construction, and this is such an important part of the equation because, if you just look at the latest data of the United Nations Environment Programme, looked at buildings and construction, they're responsible for over 36% of global energy consumed and as much as 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions. So looking at buildings and construction is such an important component of this topic. Knowing that more than half of the population lives in cities means that the energy consumption of cities has a disproportionate impact on CO2 emissions. So making these technologies and infrastructure making sure that these kind of run smoothly is really important for decarbonization. So we looked at mega cities as well as smaller towns. Transportation is such an important aspect, so that's why we looked at that's why we looked at transportation as well, and looking at, for example, electric mobility, encouraging walking, cycling, and so on. These can cut emissions significantly as well. So that's why we looked at building and construction, city infrastructure, including energy and transportation. So then if you look at the criteria that we applied, so we had three main criteria, and we looked at impact. It's such an important, mention how important impact is, not just in terms of the economic impact, but also the social and environmental impact. So the impact here we measured by looking at, how well does this technology function in comparison to traditional alternatives. Then we looked at whether there is evidence showing that this technology helps to reduce carbon emissions. And if yes, by how much is this technology expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And then we looked at whether there's evidence that the technology offers an additional benefit beyond cutting emissions. So we also looked at economic and social benefits. And then is there evidence that the technology can kind of cause harm as well? Because that's also one of the things, as we just heard from Tim as well, there can be positive as well as negative consequences of introducing technologies. We looked at scalability. As scalability, we mean to what extent this technology is currently developed, and then how high are the initial investment costs by governments and individuals, and what is the technology's ease of integration into a city based on additional infrastructure required, in addition to the technology itself. And then we looked at investment, and this is such an important part. Anything we do at Economist Impact, you need to take into account the investment potential, both private and public. So we looked at what is the total equity funding amount for these kind of technologies, so producing technology, what is the total number of investment firms and individual investors interested, because that also shows that maybe the volume of investment isn't that large, but there are a lot of investors now interested in this technology, and what are the national, regional, city regulations that support technology investment, R&D, and so on in this technology. So these are the criteria, and here they are, the 12. Drum roll. So then we have them here. So we looked at these 12, and you can see which ones are doing really well. If you look at the red, it's very high scalability, for example, for high efficiency heat pumps, low carbon and concrete alternatives, very high scalability. But some of them still have kind of low investment potential. You will be able to see that the investment column in particular is kind of not doing as well as the others, which just shows that maybe governments and individual investors haven't really grasped the investment potential for these technologies. These are not necessarily the top 12, as I mentioned, but they received high or very high scores for the indicators. You can actually look at all of the 26 that we scored on our website, impact.economist.com/sustainability. Everything, including the spreadsheet with all of the data, is freely available. So now let's look at each of those individual sectors. So for buildings and construction, let's highlight some examples here. So for example, digital twins. Digital twins are a virtual replica of a building that monitors and mirrors performance in real time. And this is such an exciting development now. It only received a medium score in the impact and scalability categories. They do outperform, for example, building automation systems, but they require substantial amounts of energy to operate. So again, similar to a lot of technologies, they have benefits, but they also have costs. And in this case, there's a lot of energy required. They also require additional infrastructure. The technology shines in one of the investment indicators. So the current level of investment is $1.2 billion. It's quite high, but there are only few investors that are interested in this. It's a relatively novel technology, but has lots of potential. This is really an emerging technology. There are, as I mentioned, few investors. Current private sector investors are already willing to provide large financial contributions here. Let's look at another one in the buildings and construction space. So we have high efficiency heat pumps. They have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly. They could reduce energy for heating by up to 50%, emitting less CO2 than other heating methods. Technology is heavily promoted through government support, but it lacks private sector support at the moment. We looked at these 10 cities. All cities except Paris and Delhi have policies that support the implementation of high-efficiency heat pumps. As you know, in London, we have the domestic renewable heat incentive now that encourages households to use renewable energy to heat their homes. as part of these ongoing strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And through this domestic renewable heat incentive, households that install eligible heating systems, like those kind of high efficiency heat pumps, can receive a quarterly payment for 7 years, subject to adherence to the scheme's rules. So there is that investment and that opportunity. Let's look at city infrastructure. And here, we can look at smart grids, for example, smart grids and smart meters. And here we can see that the implementation is estimated to lead to a 12% reduction in energy and greenhouse gas emissions, and provides a very high number of potential benefits. The benefits include a more efficient transmission of electricity, faster restoration of electricity after power disturbances, reduced operation and management costs for utilities, and that means ultimately lower power costs for consumers, reduced peak demand, which also helps lower electricity rates, and also increased integration of large-scale renewable energy systems, which then, of course, reduces CO2 emissions of the electricity grid. So clear benefits here. It scores, as you can see, high on all fronts: impact, scalability, and investment. And this is, of course, coupled with this support from government, also private sector investors that have called attention to the importance of the need for greater integration of this technology. In Delhi, for example, the Ministry of Power has a national smart grid mission that enables smart grid projects to, providing funding for up to 30% of a project's costs. So this is an exciting opportunity. Unified communications, as we all know, very important. Voice over Internet Protocol is part of that. It's, of course, as everyone knows, has this kind of unexpected technology that has these benefits in terms of city decarbonization. During the pandemic, it has highlighted the environmental impact that unified communications can have. Millions of people carried on working and going to school from home, significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with travel. And of course, this technology will continue to be important post-pandemic. There is, of course, the opportunity for the hybrid working models, as we know, a positive impact on emissions, of course, as well as quality of life for many people. It can reduce CO2 emissions between 2020 and 2050 by up to 4 gigatons of CO2, huge potential. It scores high in scalability because these technologies are broadly available and already are being implemented in most places as a result of the pandemic. So huge opportunities here. If we look at transportation, and as we know, transportation also is such an important part of decarbonization, let's focus on mobility as a service. Using a phone or a web app, mobility as a service integrates across different modes of public and private transport. With additional newer mobility services, ride sharing, for example, e-scooters, that allows users to travel door to door with a single interface. So huge opportunity here. Potential security risks. We needed to kind of look at the whole impact. So obviously there are security risks, significant logistical and technical challenges as well. Developing these and implementing these systems. This obviously has an impact on the technology score for this category. It's obviously an emerging technology. It's got high in scalability. It's available to implement across all the countries we looked at. Relatively low cost, opportunities to leverage as well, existing transport infrastructure. Private investment is high, $2.3 billion already, but it hasn't really received the public and government investment that could really help to scale this technology. So on the investment side, it only receives a medium score. And then we have vehicle-to-grid technologies, or V2G, and often used in combination with electric vehicles. They enable kind of energy stored in charged car batteries to be used as an energy supply source at times of high demand, supporting grid balancing. So we have, in addition to the benefits offered from switching from traditional to electric vehicles, there's also the opportunity kind of optimizing these V2G technologies, and these could actually enable a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 24%. So huge opportunity in this space, often overlooked. Currently, V2G technologies are more or less in the pilot stage in most of the cities in the study. Some implementation is occurring in France, Spain, Korea, also the UK and the US. So there is lots of opportunities to develop this more. And as you can see, it only receives a low investment score despite its high potential. And then just finally, in terms of city policies, we have a couple of best practices here. We just did a case study on Warsaw as well. Have a look on the website. We looked at, for example, in New York, the Smart City Challenge funded cities across the US to create an integrated smart transportation system using data, applications, digital technology to help achieve efficient and low-carbon mobility. It leveraged over $350 million in public and private funds to support kind of innovative ideas such as mobility as a service projects. So this is one example of a recent best practice. And then we have Barcelona. The EU has actually mandated 80% of smart meter uptake by 2020. Spain has been a leader in smart meter proliferation. Almost 100% of homes implement some form of smart meters in Barcelona. That's very impressive. And then we have Seoul in South Korea, and they have a pilot scheme to incentivize zero energy building development, and they subsidize 80% of the cost of installing building automation systems. There are many more best practice examples in the study. As I mentioned, have a look at impact.economist.com/sustainability. All of the data is freely available. And happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So this comes where we get to the questions, and I've actually got some questions here that come from Martin's presentation more than anything else, and that is that I'm an engineer. I'm predisposed to see problems, to then identify how to solve the problem, how to optimize that problem. We generally tend to optimize the biggest issues that are in any particular scenario. We try to look at how to have the best return on our time and investment. So the question really for you, Martin, is media and telecoms was notably absent from many of the focus areas from your presentation. So where does media and telecoms come in the scale of return on investment, basically, for effort?
In a way, it is represented through the unified communications. Mm-hmm. So there is, I mean, as I mentioned, actually the potential post-pandemic for unified communications is enormous. And often it is not really as appreciated as it should be as a decarbonization technology. So in addition to all of the benefits in terms of hybrid working, more flexibility, in terms of needing to do this, it's actually a great decarbonization technology as well. And there's a lot of media and communications element in all of these technologies. If you look at the need to spread the word about these technologies. So, for example, the fact that the technology that I just mentioned, we have the V2G technology, for example, is very much under communicated. There's a little awareness that these technologies have great impact. So I think the media industry as a whole has a role to play in communicating about the need for decarbonization, the potential that these technologies have.
Okay. So to take it more from actually Tim's presentation, there's a lot of enablers in what we're doing rather than necessarily being polluters, mm-hmm. in terms of the scale of return.
That's right, yeah.
And Tim, your thoughts on that? Because you've talked about that in your presentation. What are your thoughts now after seeing Martin's?
I think I'd agree. I mean, I think that when you look at the list of 12 and also the list of 26 that you see afterwards, a lot of the benefits from that come from increased communication. I mean, it's all the technologies. There's a huge list of technologies there which are required to get the best out of environmental impact. So it's reduced environmental impact. And a lot of that comes down to technology use and making sure that communications is in place. I mean, in order for, as you say, in order for V2G to work, you actually need to know how much energy is being used in the network and whether you actually need to get energy flowing in a certain direction. And all of that comes down to making sure the communications are there. So absolutely, I'd agree with that.
Okay. So the other point that also came from this was looking at the overall holistic view of energy usage, of decarbonisation, etc. And again, there is still going to be some challenges with the telecom side, media telecom side, in doing those enablers, and it's still got an impact on the market. In your presentation, Martin, you also concentrate on financial value associated with it. Are there your thoughts on any other motivators?
Yeah, so there's definitely the economic, but also the social element. And when we looked at impact, and that also came through in your presentations as well, is that often the whole sustainability spectrum isn't looked at. It's either focusing on the economics, focusing on the social element, or too much focus on the environmental element, but actually looking at impact from economic, social, and environmental perspective is really important. And that's what we try to integrate into the impact equation. So for example, mobility as a service, another actually technology that has a media and communications component, does really well, but it's also a way of creating new opportunities, creating new jobs, creating new ways of lowering distances and these kind of things. But it also has a cost. It has a cost because it potentially also kills jobs. It creates jobs as well as kills jobs. And that is often something that we need to take into account. It has benefits for certain people and has costs for other people.
Okay. And Tim, in your presentation, you touched on the way the regulators aren't themselves motivated to actually drive the motivation in companies to do better jobs with regard to the environment. How do you see that changing then, other than just changing the basis of their engagement? Is there anything else that we can do?
No, I think following on from what Martin just said, there's a kind of question about what people are willing to do. Mm-hmm. We can sit here, we can talk about all the things that we could do to try and make sure that we are making less of an environmental impact. And there was a question earlier about, should we move back to terrestrial? And I'm going to sit here and I'm going to look like I've got something in it for terrestrial. But the thing is that, yes, sure, terrestrial may have a lower economic impact kind of per person or overall, but it also has less functionality. And it's going to be very difficult to get people to accept that they should watch more live TV on terrestrial if they are used to watching it on demand, or they want to be able to interact with it, or whatever. So you have to sort of come at it from ensuring that what you are doing to make sure that you reduce your environmental impact does not impact on people's utility. Yeah. So we talk about the kind of the social impact of all these policies, and this is actually a relatively recent thing for regulators to think about how does this impact on the social welfare of people. You're now going to have to say, well as that social welfare, you sort of have to keep that the same and try and keep the economic side efficient as well, but at the same time, just make sure it's not bad for the environment. So it's not an easy task.
It's not It's not about how to stop people doing things. It's about how to enable them to do it more effectively and sustainably.
Exactly.
Okay. And from that, then, it comes down to, in that new era, that new way of consuming content, streaming that we've now been doing for the last 10, 15 years. Dom?
25 years.
Yeah, you described a very complicated network that we couldn't see on the
I'm
board.
sorry about the diagram.
Yeah, no, we couldn't even see that.
Happy to share it
That's just a model.
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
And so where's the big bang per buck to get an impact in reducing the impact of streaming, considering consumers want it, considering the utilities, what they're after? How do we make it more effective?
I can give you some sort of broad brush, sweeping engineering suggestions that may well not work economically. IP multicast is the one that stands out above all in live streaming. IP multicast is the greatest technology that never was, because there's a lot of people making a lot of money out of inefficiency. And that cannibalizes making things more efficient quite often cannibalizes quite a nice revenue generator for people, and that's a big challenge. IP multicast sort of stands above all in my mind, in my space, as a key thing. I think beyond that, it's a conversation. Actually touching on the policy and on the regulatory side of thing. I think part of it's a conversation with the consumer about what's good enough. Not exceeding good enough unnecessarily. The nice thing about IP technologies is you generally can provision an exceedingly good service on an on-demand basis. So not on-demand video, but on if I want to watch a 32K UHD 4,000 frames a second high-quality video, because that's my thing, you can actually deliver that for single users. But the question is, when you're dealing with a mass market where you put the sort of median line for the good enough services, and so you don't constantly cache stuff deep in expensive caching, energy expensive caching environments, when only a couple of people are really using it purely to put it on your marketing and say, we now support this. And if you manage expectations with audiences to say, well, if you want the ultra service, you might have to wait 4 seconds. But if you want the sort of median service, you can click and watch it. And understanding that conversation with the consumer isn't something I think we've had enough conversation and developed enough feedback. So a real sort of candidate for that. One of the groups we've been talking to with Greening and Streaming has been talking about green button services as part of their streaming mission. So if you are extremely energy conscious in your consumption, click the green button and we'll try to get the message back down the delivery chain to just give you the less than premium quality service, but something that you're happy with because it's maybe 30 times, 50 times more energy efficient through the circuit and so on. And so there's a conversation to be had with the consumer as much as making decisions as engineers and the economics. You know, as I mentioned, IP multicast is the way to make live streaming more efficient, but it's going to put a bunch of people who deliver the inefficient way out of business, and we have that complex challenge.
And is there a balance in that technology investment to get that if consumption is moving more away from live? For general,
I don't know that consumption is moving more away from live, actually. I think actually, certainly in the streaming world, live having a massive explosion at the moment. The availability and immediacy of live sources has proliferated and is driving live as a technology. You know, you have to think beyond just linear TV and think about all the live streaming applications that are being delivered, all of the different conferencing tools that are emerging and so on. Actually, live would probably dwarfs on-demand content, but the internet, for legacy reasons, evolved and is still talked of as an on-demand environment. But I've never worked with on-demand video, and I've worked with streaming for 25 years. I have worked with it, but it's more of an adjunct.
Yes. Do we have some questions from the wider audience out there in the...
So I'll start with a question from Josephine Harrison. Apologies if I paraphrase it a bit. I think she's essentially asking, what about the other sustainable development goals? Because we've talked a lot about climate, but there are also other goals around ecological limits, social and environmental inclusion. I might combine that with a question of my own and say, if you're trying to optimise 27 things, I think there are 27 sustainable development goals, does that mean you really have to generalise the models that we've seen from Martin and from Tim and from Glynn into actually quite a sophisticated bit of software that tells you, when you're designing or updating a service, what you need to do to try and maintain compatibility with all those goals?
If I go first on that, I mean, I think that it's a very valid point, and as I mentioned, there's been a trade-off in the past for regulators between economic efficiency and social welfare maximisation. If you're then trying to actually maximise or optimise things over 27 different goals, it's going to be really difficult to do. And so you do need to have some sort of prioritisation in the way you're thinking about it. I don't think it's my place to sit here and say what that should be, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, and I think that's really what we came to as a recommendation, that it's a conversation that needs to be had. And obviously we've been doing stuff in providing communications to kind of developing countries and kind of remote locations and so on for years now. Not personally, but enabling it for kind of regulators in developing countries and so on. So we know about that sort of stuff, but we've never really thought about the environmental impact before. And as I said, you don't want to take away that digital inclusion work by saying, well, actually, it's going to have a massive environmental impact, so let's not do it. You just want to try and make sure you do it in the way that is most efficient.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that as well that, one thing that we want to make sure in the impact rating is that there are no unintended consequences, that we don't just focus on reducing emissions, but that we are not suddenly creating health risks, for example, like digital twins, for example. There are security risks associated with it. There are environmental benefits, but security risks. You need to balance that. But I would say across those SDGs, there are actually lots of synergies. Like, for example, we're talking a lot about sustainable consumption. There's actually an SDG on cities as well. There is an SDG on decent work. What we want to make sure is that as we work towards decarbonization, we create high-quality jobs. And we create them also that we don't create new poverty. And that is also one of the SDGs. So creating synergies between the SDGs and making sure there are no unintended consequences as we focus on decarbonization is really important.
Thanks.
Can I just chip in on the unintended consequences? Something that's complex specifically within the streaming strata, without commenting on the sort of wider economic and social issues. A really nice model for the engineers who perhaps tuned into the IT. Data attribution has become a very established reference so far for how to try to apportion ownership of internet services. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of my own personal doubts. It's not a greening or streaming thing. It's my own personal doubts about the validity of that, because I think it's very important to measure the power required to make infrastructure available before you even send a stream. And if you measure just the stream, it's kind of back to Glynn's point about the router. The router's on 24/7, but if you only watch an hour of Netflix, then Netflix only... Well, actually, if the router wasn't on, Netflix couldn't deliver a service. So there has to be some... we have to address that ownership of the shared infrastructure somehow, and it's a really complicated challenge. But with data attribution as a sort of historical way of referencing these efficiencies, if you simply make the efficiency in one part of the value chain, you can actually have a really adverse effect further down the chain. So companies working in our sector in isolation tend to think, oh, I can give you a higher video compression. Therefore, it's less data that can be attributed to data attribution, so it must be greener. So automatically the codec is marketed as a greener codec. The problem is when you then go and transcode the back catalogue of the BBC or the iPlayer's historic long-tail content and burn several terawatt hours of energy converting your back catalogue, and nobody ever watches that, that's a completely false strategy in terms of any green energy. So transcoding stuff on demand when it's actually required, or at least doing the first transcode and making sure that can loop back into the system, is a different strategy. But pre-transcoding it just because it's in theory going to be greener further down the line is a false economy on both probably financially and certainly in terms of energy efficiency and so on. So
I think that also comes down to the fact that when we use the word optimization, we're using it in a very engineering-like way. Yeah. Optimization does not mean maximum minimizing. It means actually determining a solution that's optimum based on all inputs and all outputs.
Yes, and I was really pleased to see such a heavy focus on the corporate impact, the operation around the digital media objective. One company with two people running it and delivering, a YouTube scale business is completely different to another company with 3,000 executives who are all flying around to all the conferences and so on, and yet delivering essentially the same service. One has a clearly much larger carbon footprint or much larger sustainability challenge ahead of it.
Okay. Any more from the online?
Yeah, I've got one from Graham Turner, who's a previous chair of this network. So
my predecessor.
I've got to get his question in. He's asking, there's a push by telcos and companies like Google to get IoT devices into the home. Is there an opportunity to leverage that? He didn't use the word leverage, actually. I shouldn't put that word into his mouth. It's a terrible word. Is there opportunities to use that capability to improve energy efficiencies in homes?
Who wants to go for that one?
Yes. There's a very specific thing, actually. I don't know how many people are tuned in, but if I had one ask of the industry at the moment, I'd ask smart meters to be included in computer power supplies. Because at the moment, it's actually impossible from an IT level to read the system you're using, the power demand of the system you're using, without plugging a meter in between the plug and the wall, because we've got no visibility of what's going on in the power supply. So if there was an industry pressure group, I personally would like to see at the moment, is to force PSU manufacturers to give the IT system or the owner of the system the ability to say, how much energy am I using? Because at the moment, we're blind.
So you basically, it's not real-time optimization, but you want to instrument the network so you can make better decisions.
There is a disconnect between energy and IT, and it sits across the power supply. In the data center, you've got top of rack, which you often have that infrastructure management read on But on individual computers, you might know what your chipset's using, but you've got no idea as an aggregate what the whole computer's using. So we're completely blind. It's all finger in the air at the moment, other than measuring the total input to the data center. So that would be my ask.
I mean, it's not just computers, though. I mean, it's basically everything in the household that uses energy. Yeah. There's a massive push to everyone having a smart meter and understanding what their energy use is. And they say, oh, yes, you can save so much energy by having a smart meter. But actually, if you look at the smart meter, it doesn't tell you what is using that energy. It just says, you've used this much energy, and here it's used during this time of the day. And so actually, having something that's a bit more disaggregated or discrete forms of energy is actually going to be helping to reduce that as well. Yeah.
So it's about being able to use it, because at the end of the day, we all talk about smart meters. They're actually pretty much they're all dumb. The only thing that's smart about them is sometimes we don't need someone to come and read it.
Yeah.
Which is a bit like the models we're all using as well. That we have models where some of them are based on empirical data, some of them are based on guesswork. And we're optimizing those models as well.
And the thing is that there are things that can be done going forwards, and it's things like the power networks can understand when there are peaks in demand and when there are troughs, and try and make sure that things are being used in the troughs where it can. And that comes down to, again, having more equipment put in that will turn things on at the right time. Mm-hmm. But it comes again down to having the proper measurements and monitoring systems in place, which currently they just don't have.
Mm-hmm. I would like to probably finish off with one question to each of you, and it's probably the big God question, the question that you just want to throw in there and see what you think, and that is, what would you, if you had one thing you could do, what would it be to improve sustainability? One thing. Dom.
I think you've got to take the input side of it out, because obviously if we can take the energy input, and that's obviously got to be a priority, is decarbonise the inputs. On the output, I think getting some better visibility, by my last point really, obligating power supply vendors of any IT technology to give us some visibility of the power would be a good start, because then we'll know what we're doing. So that would be my request.
Tim.
I was trying to think if there's anything other than what I put as my kind of first recommendation.
Obviously, you had lots there. You've got to look for one. What's your big thing?
I think the big thing is making sure that the people who are making the decisions, so whether it be regulators or governments, do actually have an obligation to think about environmental impact when they're doing it, because currently they don't.
And Martin?
For me, it would be bridging that gap between investment and impact, because currently, if you could see that in the table produced, that there's lots of impact, positive impact, lots of scalability opportunity, but the investment isn't there. So, and that is both public and private, and often it's either or. It's either the government going in and then private investors kind of having a wait-and-see attitude, or private investors really going in, like, for example, with autonomous vehicles and these kind of things, but then, government's not really on board. So bridging that gap between impact and investment, that's really crucial.
Okay, excellent. Well, I've only got one thing left to do, that's to hand over back to David. Oh, no, you can wrap up, David. Come on, stand up at the front at least. Because you've been very instrumental in putting this together, so you've got to take that. So how would you like to end?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to those who are watching online. I mean, I think what we've been trying to do here is to share knowledge. I mean, one of the things we noticed is that the people on the delegate list are quite senior, and that's good. But we want to see this cascade down. So we want to see. So I was thinking, like 20 years ago, or maybe if you talk to software engineers about, say, non-functional aspects of their software, like security or reliability, you might have a difficult conversation, but it's now embedded in the culture. That engineers just know they have to make things, they have to make them economic, obviously, they have to make them secure, they have to make them reliable, they have to make them maintainable. And we need to, as an industry, both within the broadcast industry as a wider industry, find ways that we embed that culture so that it's second nature to people to make things sustainable. And I think with that, I'll close the conference. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.